Hi, and welcome to Source Material from Digital Spy. Ahead of our Star Wars Disney Plus show, this week we're looking at the journey of Ahsoka Tano. We're going to take you through her journey so far, some of our own personal favourite Ahsoka stories, and also have a little think about what we might expect to see in her first solo live-action series. So let's get started. The origins of Ahsoka Tano. Ahsoka was first created by George Lucas and Dave Filoni, who now is kind of the head honcho at Star Wars across all of their live-action TV series. But back in the day, he was the guy that kicked off the animated side of the Star Wars universe, in charge of Clone Wars and then Rebels. Ahsoka made her first appearance in the Clone Wars movie in 2008, which acted as sort of a long-form pilot for the series. And she was, I would say, kind of the POV character for Star Wars fans. She comes on board as Anakin's newly appointed Padawan. Her kind of role in the film is to reflect his sort of angsty over-eagerness and kind of be a mirror to that. And also, she was designed with the idea that she would kind of act as a narrative bridge between the Anakin that we see at the end of episode 2 and at the start of episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. She reflects that journey that we see the character go on. If you think back to Attack of the Clones, teen Anakin is kind of like angry and petulant and kind of annoying, and he's still sort of angry and petulant and annoying in episode 3, but he's taken on this sort of more reserved, authorial kind of vibe, and Ahsoka is meant to sort of mirror that journey for us as an audience. She was also designed to give Anakin more responsibility and kind of to bring out a more caring, orderly side of him. It all works to build Anakin up to kind of this. There is like a caring, warm-hearted side of him, obviously, which then gets subverted as he becomes Darth Vader and Order 66 and all that. But Ahsoka is another piece of the puzzle that characterises Anakin as someone with a lot of personal connections, and their relationship, which we'll talk about as kind of Padawan and Master, again adds depth to the idea that maybe Anakin has these relationships that the Jedi Order might traditionally sort of frown on. Across the animated shows that Ahsoka appears in, she's voiced entirely by Ashley Eckstein. Obviously, Ashley Eckstein was not kind of translated into live action across the Mandalorian and now in the Ahsoka main show, where she'll be played by Rosario Dawson. But I wanted to shout out Ashley Eckstein at this point in the video because she's phenomenal as Ahsoka, and she really embodied that character for like a decade plus. You know, she still comes back and voices her in animated shows now, and she's just a brilliant actress. And I think it's interesting to think a little bit about why Ashley Eckstein wasn't brought on to kind of play the character in live action, and also to kind of point out at this point in the video that the live action version of Ahsoka that we're going to get and that we've seen in Mandalorian and Book of Boba Fett should be considered kind of like in direct conversation with the animated version. I think as we move to a world where animated Star Wars characters and ideas and properties that people love kind of get upgraded into live action, it's worth pausing and thinking about like how in that mode we might dismiss the kind of animated version of those characters, those performances, which really grounded them and brought them to life in the first place. Also with Ahsoka, she's got blue and white skin. She's a Togruta, female Togruta, with these kind of long head tendrils that get longer over the course of her life. She's a really cool kind of striking character design. She starts off with a single lightsaber, then she has these 2 green lightsabers during season 3 of Clone Wars, then they're blue at the end of Clone Wars, then she has those 2 sick white lightsabers in Mandalorian and some Rebel stories. She's a really, really cool design, and I think part of the reason, and this happens all the time with animated shows, but you need a really strong, cool character design that can then kind of change over time and captures people and becomes iconic. And I think Ahsoka's visual look is absolutely that. I think Dave Filoni has said at points like the kind of inspiration behind the way that she looks, the way that her head tendrils fall, her armor. Filoni's like big into Japanese cinema and samurai stories, for better or worse, and you can see a lot of that influence in the way that he kind of pictured Ahsoka and presumably first pitched her to George Lucas, who also shared those interests. The history of Ahsoka Tano. Okay, so we're going to dig into the long, well not so long, but the storied history of Ahsoka Tano across the Clone Wars movie, Star Wars The Clone Wars, the TV series, Star Wars Rebels, Tales of the Jedi, The Mandalorian Season 2, Book of Boba Fett, and then obviously leading into the Ahsoka TV show. I'm going to do this in release order, not chronological order. I'm going to stand by that decision. I think it helps us kind of like tackle the retcons as they come up. I think that's interesting to look back and think, why was elements of the story changed at the point in time that they were changed? And also, I think Clone Wars has so much baggage around like the right order to watch it and watching it in chronological order, and I just don't think that's an interesting way to engage with these stories. So we're just going to go from kind of her first appearance right up till now, pull out some of our favourite moments from those episodes and kind of give you a brief overview of the key things she did at key moments in Star Wars history. Star Wars The Clone Wars movie. Ahsoka First turns up in the 2007 Clone Wars film, which, like I said earlier, acts as sort of a long-form pilot to the TV series. It's produced by a lot of the same team that produced season 1 of Clone Wars and sets up some of the ideas, character traits and dynamics we'll see play out across the rest of the show. Ahsoka is a newly appointed Padawan to Anakin, and she joins him and Obi-Wan on a mission to Christophsis, which is a battle zone that we'll see recur again and again across the first 4 seasons of Clone Wars. Earlier we spoke about the show's weird chronology, and trying to work out where the movie fits in that story is kind of going to leave your head scrambled, but I think starting here is interesting. We see Anakin and her kind of back and forth. She is able to kind of meet Anakin head on with his energy. She's sort of peppy and angsty and energetic and emotional in a way that Anakin is, and I think that's what makes their dynamic so interesting. But yeah, like I said, this is not a film you need to watch, but it does set up the kind of the start of Clone Wars. The Clone Wars seasons 1 to 6. Okay, so Ahsoka's journey really begins in the Clone Wars Season 1. Clone Wars was a 20-minute long animated anthology series, really, set during the events of Episode 2 and Episode 3. Over the course of 6 seasons, and then 7 eventually, we watched a core cast of Ahsoka, Anakin, Obi-Wan, and other members of the Jedi Council go out on missions during the Clone Wars. They fought separatists, destroyed droids, and in the mix there, what the Clone Wars was able to do was tease out some of the really kind of big form, interesting ideas that Lucas wanted to explore in the prequel trilogy, but maybe didn't have time or wasn't able to really kind of get to grips with those ideas. We learn more about the origins of the clones. We learn about, you know, what do they feel about the war? How do they relate to the Jedi? Who the separatists are? How are they organized? Those sorts of ideas that, again, we didn't get to kind of fully understand. Ahsoka is a big part of that journey, and across the course of the show, we watch her grow from this kind of petulant, emotional Padawan into quite a formidable general, much like Anakin. As we mentioned at the beginning, a lot of Ahsoka's initial appeal is her mirroring of Anakin's own journey. She's a perfect foil for him. She kind of can pull him back, but also in her he sees kind of maybe the Jedi he would have been if he was born at a different time. She's, like I say, emotional, very battle ready, and that allows the story to kind of play with the two of them in orbit of each other. You know, Ahsoka is one of the most beloved Star Wars characters of all time at this point. She's certainly one of the kind of greatest female Star Wars characters of all time. Not that there are a ton of them that get great stories, but Ahsoka really does. Over the course of the Clone Wars, like I said, we get to see her grow from Padawan to formidable general. She has all of these kind of complex arcs. She has all of these interpersonal relationships that really matter. And she works, I think, particularly as a lens through which to view the Jedi Order. Ahsoka is part of a generation of Jedi that essentially graduate to being Padawan and Jedi Knight during wartime. So if you think about kind of like the way that Star Wars positions the Jedi in different medium, you know, we think of them as kind of being like monks and peacekeepers and I guess kind of a religious sect. But during the Clone Wars, they become generals, right? And that's kind of like the central tension of conversations around the Jedi across the prequel trilogy and then into Clone Wars as well. Is like, how do you justify the kind of acts of war they're doing with their supposed kind of religious offerings? And Ahsoka sits in this middle kind of fulcrum point between being adopted into Jedi Order when she was a child, but now as an active Jedi, all she's doing is going out and like fighting people. And what does that do to you, and how does that change her relationship with the Force? It's a story that gets kind of teased apart across lots and lots of different episodes, but the kind of key moments to look out for really are her relationship with Mandalore and Darth Maul, how she interacts with Darth Maul, how she thinks about him as a kind of apprentice of Dooku and Sidious, and her own positioning within kind of Anakin, Obi-Wan, and their relationship with Dooku, and her general kind of the stuff she gets up to on Mandalore is really, really interesting. The way that she interacts with people like Bo-Katan Kryze, who obviously we've seen in Mandalorian, and also Satine, rest in peace. She has this really dynamic relationship with a culture that obviously now we see play out in Mandalorian with Jyn. So the last arc of season 5 sees Ahsoka falsely accused of committing kind of a large-scale terrorist attack. And the reason that she's accused of that is they know that a Jedi was responsible, and I think her lightsaber was found on the scene. Over the course of 4 episodes, we watch Ahsoka go on this kind of like PI story with Anakin, where they try and work out who it was that was responsible. She's on the run. It's basically all a big riff on The Fugitive. But the major payoff that comes during an incredible courtroom scene with Darth Sidious is that Ahsoka, as we know, wasn't guilty, and the person who was guilty was actually Ahsoka's kind of long-term friend who we've seen across the series, Barriss Offee. Sorry for spoilers. But it's a really, really phenomenal story. We get to see Ahsoka interact with Asajj Ventress, another phenomenal Clone Wars character, and the way that we get to see her kind of ousting from the Jedi Order is going to then shape the character as she develops across Rebels and at the character that we're going to meet now in the Disney Plus show. So this is a really key moment for her as she becomes disillusioned with everything the Jedi stands for. Star Wars Rebels. Although it wasn't initially clear that Ahsoka was going to return for Rebels, it was of course a show directed and written by Dave Filoni, and he loves Ahsoka and we love Ahsoka, so obviously he brings her back to the show at the end of season 1. Ahsoka is revealed at that moment to be the leader-ish, or the kind of the linchpin for a series of rebel cells at the very start of the rebellion. Aided by Bail Organa, she operates as Fulcrum and is the person that's kind of passing Imperial information to different rebel cells. She's helping our heroes out on various kind of missions and jobs and journeys. Rebels is set years after the events of Clone Wars, and we see a much more kind of adult, independent Ahsoka emerge from that experience. She has 2 cool white lightsabers. She's most definitely not a Jedi in either the way that she thinks about herself or kind of interacts with the 2 other Jedi-ish characters on the show, Kanan and Ezra, which is interesting because Kanan and Ezra, although they're kind of in the lineage of Jedi, and Kanan is trying to impart his understanding of what it means to be a Jedi Knight onto Ezra, neither of those 2 really are part of the Order either. Obviously, we learn that Kanan didn't complete his Padawan training. You know, Order 66 happens when he's basically like 11, and Ezra was never kind of formally trained either. So as we get distance from the prequels, kind of the stretchiness about what it means to be a Jedi is kind of built upon. Obviously, you know, Luke has Obi-Wan, but beyond that, he's not like in formal training. Thinking about Ahsoka as kind of like the wandering warrior, it's just how she's presented in Rebels, who kind of pops up and helps people, is in some ways much more in line with the way the Jedi are pitched in the trilogy. At the end of season 2, Ahsoka learns that Anakin didn't die during Order 66 and that he is Darth Vader. And in this, like, it's just some of the best Star Wars storytelling ever, but the end of season 2 sees her accompany Ezra on a mission that brings her face to face with Vader. They have this big duel. It's not clear kind of entirely what's happening, but they're in a Jedi temple and then she seemingly dies at the end of it, and it's really, really epic. So Ahsoka duels with Vader inside a big Sith temple on Malachor, and she basically buys Ezra and the crew of the Ghost time to escape. We then didn't see her, we didn't know how that fight ended until a year later, until midway through season 4, which is really crazy. Basically, and it's kind of hard to recap, and I recommend you just go and watch these episodes, but what happens is that using some sort of kind of interdimensional timey-wimey bending stuff, Ezra travelled to kind of like an in-between space using the Force, and basically he pulls Ahsoka through time just before the moment that she should have been killed by Vader, and kind of puts her in this weird nowhere space. And we don't see her again until the very finale of Rebels, in a post-credits scene, after Ezra has gone missing, after trying to fight Thrawn, the Siege of Lothal, which you don't need to worry about. But essentially, Ezra is missing, and Sabine and Ahsoka are shown sort of teaming up once more to go out and find him. The key thing about Ahsoka in Rebels is the maturity that she shows and how she has grown since her days in the Clone Wars. She's a really badass warrior. She has those 2 lightsabers. She's independent. She cares very deeply about the rebellion. She doesn't want to see people crushed by the Empire. But she's firmly not a Jedi. Ahsoka by E.K. Johnson. The Ahsoka novel, which is fun, is a little bit tricky just because, although it remains largely canon, chunks of its story were kind of tweaked and retold both in Ahsoka's episodes in Clone Wars Season 7 and also in the final Ahsoka episode of Tales of the Jedi, which came out last year. But the broad strokes are, before we meet her in Rebels, under the name Ashla, she works as an engineer on a planet. She saves the lives of these 2 children using Force powers, and because she knows that the Empire are out there and the Inquisitors have just started up, she kind of flees and moves to a planet called Rada. Whilst on Rada, she can't help but get herself in trouble again, obviously because she's great. She learns that the Empire have been providing farmers on Rada with a kind of self-sustaining crop, or crop basically that fails after a single harvest, so they have to keep buying from them, and keeps them kind of placated. When she discovers this, she joins a group of rebels and kind of starts an uprising that brings the Empire to Rada. And whilst the Empire on Rada, she again uses her force powers. Do you think she'd get this by now? She uses her force powers to prevent them killing a friend of hers, and obviously they see, and now they know that there's another Jedi out there, so she flees again. She flees back to the planet she was first on, and while there, she encounters Bail Organa, who you remember we mentioned during a Rebels recap that she kind of, we know that they have a relationship, and this is sort of the origins in some ways of that relationship. She encounters Bail Organa. He says to her that he can provide safe haven for Force-sensitive children, because she's also found one of those, and they begin kind of their relationship as Fulcrum and Bail as this position of kind of like the legitimate face of the rebellion. You know, he's able to pass the rebels information and also use his resources to kind of fund things. Clone Wars Season 7! Woo. Yes, that's right. I told you we were going to do it in release order. So here we are, Clone Wars Season 7, after Rebels and after the Ahsoka novel, which is no longer canon. In 2020, Disney Plus, to great anticipation from fans, released the kind of promised final season of Clone Wars, which showed the events, among some other things, showed the events of Order 66 and kind of showed us where our Clone Wars favourite characters, mainly Ahsoka and Rex, were during the events of Revenge of the Sith. Before we got to those incredible episodes though, we did have some other stuff to deal with. We watched Ahsoka befriend two sisters, Trace and Rafa, on Coruscant, who hate the Jedi. She helps them with their chop shop, she helps them like do some small petty crimes, evades some guys that are after them, and kind of hides the fact that she's a Jedi from them until she's forced to reveal it at the last minute. I think it's interesting to think about the Trace and Rafa story, just because, again, so much of Ahsoka's journey is about kind of like concealing her identity and the moments at which she wants to be a Jedi, and kind of she also sees how people interact with that and might have a negative opinion of her because of it. The good bits of Clone Wars Season 7 basically centre around two major events, Order 66 obviously, and the Siege of Mandalore. The Siege of Mandalore, which is happening, which is crazy really, it's happening at the same time as Revenge of the Sith, is Maul fully kind of going to war with the Republic after taking over the throne of Mandalore during Clone Wars, kind of in this underground, sneaky way. Ahsoka, even though she's been kind of ejected from the Jedi Order and decided not to come back, gets called back by her Republic allies, and they kind of ask her to come with them and help them confront and defeat Maul, and see if she can kind of bring peace to Mandalore, because she knows the city and the country so well. During her final confrontation with Maul, he tells her that his master, Darth Sidious, his ultimate plan was to corrupt Anakin Skywalker and turn him into Darth Vader. Ahsoka can't believe this, it doesn't make any sense to her, so she tries to rush to Anakin to try and tell him what she's learned and see if it's true. And on the way to Anakin, Order 66 gets enacted. It's so good, you guys, it's so good, because we've watched Ahsoka and this batch of clones, and at this point in Clone Wars, all the Ahsoka's clones have all decided to they paint their helmets when she returns because they've missed her and she was this incredible part of their lives, and they're her clones, and when Order 66 happens you see them all turn on her, everyone apart from Rex. It's just this really incredible dramatic moment. The last shot of Clone Wars Season 7 is Vader, or Anakin as Vader, finding Ahsoka's lightsabers. I think the fact that that is the last shot of the show tells you kind of how key Ahsoka and Anakin's relationship and the way that they mirrored each other and were able to kind of go separate ways is the key part of Clone Wars. The Mandalorian Season 2. Okay, so that sort of is the end of Ahsoka's animated journey. We don't see the character again until the Mandalorian Season 2 episode, The Jedi, from 2021. This is Ahsoka's first appearance in live action, played by Rosario Dawson, as we said, and it was obviously a really cool kind of wild moment for fans of the character that had seen her on TV in these 20-minute chunks on shows that people weren't watching since 2008. So to see her fully realised was really cool. The episode basically sees Din seek Ahsoka out because Bo-Katan has told him that he needs to find the Jedi that can train Grogu. She gives him Ahsoka's name. He finds her kind of stalking a warlord in this city who's keeping people hostage and is kind of working under Imperial rules, even though the Empire has ended, and together they kind of team up and they defeat her because she's got that big Beskar spear that Mando eventually has. The crux of the story basically is that Ahsoka is like, I won't help you with Baby Yoda until you help me defeat this warlord, which they do. And then after that, we get kind of Ahsoka does a mind meld with Baby Yoda whose name we then learn is Grogu in this moment. She's able to kind of connect with him using the Force. She learns that he was a Padawan at the Jedi Temple on Coruscant. She kind of like gives us this exposition dump about who Grogu really is. But during that moment, she also reveals to Din that she won't train him because within Grogu, she senses a kind of darkness that she hasn't seen since Anakin. She thinks that his traumatic past will mean that he's kind of forever tainted. It's a really cool episode on the surface. Like, the fights that Ahsoka has with Din in the fog, in the woods, are really sick. The lightsabers look really cool in live action. And I think the costuming is amazing. And I think Rosario Dawson does a really good job of embodying the character, even if I do think she's a bit more dour and kind of serious than Ahsoka tends to be. Even in Rebels, at her most kind of severe, she was always kind of light, and I think some of that has got lost in Dawson's performance. Ahsoka basically says, like, I'm not going near Grogu, he's got bad vibes. Go to this Jedi Temple on Typhon, maybe you can reach out to another Jedi. Turn out to be Luke Skywalker. Ahsoka's reaction to Grogu is like very Jedi coded. She's like, oh, he's too like evil to make a good Jedi, and like, I wouldn't train him because he reminds me of Anakin. And I feel like the Ahsoka that we know, who went through what she did at the hands of the Order, her first concern wouldn't have been like the quality of Jedi that Grogu was going to make. I feel like she should have been a bit more compassionate maybe, or certainly like been like, it's weird to me that she recommends that he joins that he gets trained by Jedis, because like she doesn't like the Jedi, they abandoned her. I feel like over time Ahsoka's relationship to the Order has kind of like slipped and become a little bit more amorphous, because I mean, this episode that she's in is called The Jedi. She has 2 lightsabers. Like, she's cool to think about as a Jedi, but she isn't one, and actively chose not to be one. So I think, and some people will say, well, the end of Clone Wars, she kind of rejoins them and da-da-da-da. But I still think Ahsoka's story is made greater and more interesting by the distance she puts between herself and the Order. And to go back on that, I think, would be a mistake. The Book of Boba Fett. In 2022, we see Ahsoka yet again in The Book of Boba Fett, the Mandalorian spin-off, in the weird Mando side episode. He goes to where Grogu has been training with Luke. Ahsoka is there to see Luke and like check in with the Jedi school, which I think is weird, because again, I don't think Ahsoka would be like down to rebuild the Order. In fact, I don't think anyone should be rebuilding the Order. I feel like that's a bad choice, guys. It never goes well. There's a reason why we stopped doing it. In this episode of Book of Boba Fett, she kind of encounters Din while he's on the way to see Grogu, because he wants to take Grogu like the little cute chainmail shirt, which is very cute. She convinces Din not to go meet with Grogu because Grogu needs to like have no attachments, which I don't think is something that Ahsoka would think was a smart choice. I think it just feels like she's become a bit kind of zealous about the Order in a way that she never was in these scenes. She kind of sends Din away. She says that, you know, he'll be better off without you. She takes the chainmail to Luke and Grogu, and Luke has this conversation with her about, you know, he doesn't know whether he's capable of training Grogu, and will she stick around? She's like, no, I've got other stuff to do, which we then know what that's going to be. And they have this, it's very sweet to see Ahsoka and Luke interact in this episode. Obviously, she's Anakin's Padawan, so it is like, there is something special about seeing them interact. I wish we'd have got something more from this moment. You know, there's like one line where Ahsoka mentions that Luke reminds her of his dad. This could have been a really cool, more emotive moment, I think, than it was. Tales of the Jedi, episode 1, 5, and 6. Okay, so this actually is the final Ahsoka moment. Tales of the Jedi was the 2022 animated anthology Star Wars series. It was basically split into 6 short episodes, 3 of which centre on Count Dooku, and 3 of which centre on Ahsoka. The Dooku episodes are in part a retelling of a book called Dooku Jedi Lost, and the Ahsoka episodes are in part a retelling of Ahsoka by E.K. Johnston, which we already said. Dave Filoni writes Resolve, right? And he also penned the rough idea for the E.K. Johnston's book, but it's slightly different. It's weird that they can't, you know, people have made a lot of noise about the parts of the larger universe that were retconned when Disney bought the franchise. But it's weird to me to see it happening here to stuff that is definitely still canon. Like, they're still sort of tweaking stuff. It's slightly odd that they can't leave kind of well enough alone and tell a new story. The first of the episodes is called Life and Death, and it tells the story of Ahsoka's birth to this kind of Togruta village. We learn a little bit about her family's spiritual connections. It's kind of like, it's like a space India vibe in the grand tradition of Star Wars being a bit weird about kind of cultures and the kind of this exoticization of things that it does, but it's a beautiful episode. I mean, Tales of the Jedi looks unreal. It looks, if you've seen any of the Bad Batch or really Clone Wars Season 7, this photorealism that they've managed to kind of bring to these animated shows is you know, bar none. It just looks incredible. The rough story of Life and Death is basically that Ahsoka's mum goes out on this kind of like traditional ritual hunt. She goes out, they hunt a deer, a big tiger comes, they fight the tiger steals baby Ahsoka. Before the tiger can eat baby Ahsoka like does animal power Jedi stuff on the tiger, and it kind of decides to spare her, brings her back to the village, and then this old Togruta lady at the end is like, oh, she's a Jedi, and that's kind of the crux of it. Like I say, it's fairly surface level, but it is very pretty. Second lot of the Ahsoka episodes is a short called Practice Makes Perfect, which is like kind of like a training montage. It's I mean, if you're a fan of Ahsoka and Anakin, it's kind of bittersweet because it's them. I think it's set just before season 2 because Ahsoka's got the single green lightsaber at the start. It's them like doing some training sessions with droids and then Anakin's clones, because Anakin's like, droids aren't good enough to train you, you need like a real challenge. So then Rex and the gang like are all shooting Ahsoka. It's quite fun, and it's worth watching because it does this really cool transition at the very end. Big spoilers, I guess. Goes from Ahsoka being shot at by these kind of like floating droids to the clones with their like stun lasers on, and the last transition is her, and you don't realise what's happening until it's happened. She's being shot at by the clones again, she's deflecting them, and then the camera pans up and you realise that she's in her like season 7 outfit, and she's got the blue lightsabers, and that wasn't a training session, that was like the clones shooting at her because Order 66 has happened. It's really sick. And then Rex like walks her through this big door. It's a really cool moment, so it's kind of worth it for that scene alone. The Ahsoka series on Disney+. The show got announced in December of 2020. It will consist of 8 episodes, and we've learnt from director, producer and writer Dave Filoni that the show is going to be constructed in a kind of serialized way rather than having 8 specific adventures. It's worth knowing, I think, going into this, that Ahsoka is kind of joining this mini canon of kind of Mandoverse, Filoniverse shows alongside Mandalorian, Book of Boba Fett, this show, and Skeleton Crew, which isn't out yet but is out soon-ish, we think. All of these stories are kind of interconnected. They're kind of, I guess they're really the first wave of the Disney Plus Star Wars shows, and they're all feeding in, as far as we know, into one kind of major theatrical event. There's going to be a movie directed and written by Dave, which is kind of exciting if you're a Dave fan. They're all kind of funneling in towards this one larger story, which I think is going to kind of really be the end of like the Ezra Thrawn kind of epic. In terms of plot, we actually don't know too much about what the story of Ahsoka is going to be. Obviously, we've had a number of trailers at this point, and we saw in both her appearances in The Mandalorian Season 2 and Book of Boba Fett. In those shows, she talks about like she's looking for somebody, she's trying to find Thrawn, and we've learned in some pre-release stuff that her and Sabine are looking for Ezra, so it really is picking up directly from the end of Rebels. Although we can expect it to pick up some of those threads, I think they want us to think about Ahsoka as kind of a new standalone experience. Dave Filoni, like we said, is serving as kind of the showrunner. He's writing episodes, he's the lead producer, and he's directing a few key episodes. Alongside Rosario Dawson as Ahsoka Tano, we've also got some new faces taking on board familiar characters. Mary Elizabeth Winstead is playing Hera Syndulla. She is the green Twi'lek from Rebels. She's a badass pilot. She is the team leader in Rebels. She kind of elevates herself beyond just being kind of like the ship mum, which is initially how she's positioned, into being a really formidable Rebel cell operative. We're also going to see Ezra Bridger return, we think, in some form, played by Iman Esfandi. Hayden Christensen is coming back again as Anakin Skywalker. The pop punk princess herself, Sabine Wren, is coming back in Ahsoka. She's got purple hair and an orange jumpsuit, and she's played by Natasha Liu Bordizzo. Sabine is a really cool character in Rebels, and she's a really interesting character as kind of like the next heir of Mandalore in some ways, and she wields the Darksaber, and it looks like in the trailer for Ahsoka she has Ezra's green lightsaber and she's using that. What that means and how she's interacting with Jedi-ness and Ahsoka's relationship with the Jedi, which I know I'm harping on about, but I think is the core interesting thing about her character. Huge nerds and Rebels fans were excited to see Lars Mikkelsen cast as Grand Admiral Thrawn. This is the first time since Rebels that we've seen Thrawn in new canon. Originally kind of made famous in a series of novels by Timothy Zahn in the late 90s. The character was given a new lease of life in the new canon. He's a really interesting character, and we are sure that the show is going to do some impressive things with him. The late Ray Stevenson, who sadly passed away earlier this year, is playing Baylan Skoll, who we've seen in trailers, who looks like a formidable kind of Sith enemy. It's a Star Wars show, so you've always got to have at least one person with a big glowing red lightsaber, so you know who the bad guy is, and we're excited to see what the actor brought to the role. So, major questions for Ahsoka before we wrap up. I am very curious to know how it is going to set up and where it's going to leave off the Thrawn story. I think we could see a world in which the show, across its 8 episodes, is kind of like getting the gang back together, essentially. You know, I think we could see an episode that's just Ahsoka, then she gets Sabine, then she gets Hera, and she gets Chopper, and we end the Ahsoka series with them kind of like maybe finding Thrawn or finding out where Ezra is. I'd be very surprised if we saw Ezra in person in this show. I'm also very curious to see what they do with Thrawn. Star Wars is in a weird place as a franchise, as we know, for lots of reasons, and the one thing they've kind of not been able to nail really since, I mean, who knows since when, is a lack of a big bad, a big scary villain, right? You have Snoke, who you could argue they bungled, although I quite like the Snoke reveal. Kylo Ren, who does the Star Wars redemption arc in a way that some people like and some people don't like. Somehow Palpatine returned. In Mandalorian, Moff Gideon was there, and then kind of like was a bit of a wet fart. We haven't had, I don't think, a really compelling villain in a Star Wars show or a movie for quite a while, and Lars Mikkelsen as Thrawn could really be that. There's a reason why this blue-skinned freak is beloved by the Star Wars kind of fandom, and it's because he's really compelling, he's really sinister, he's this kind of master tactician who rose through the ranks of the Empire despite being an alien, and there's something really interesting about him. He's not Sith, he doesn't have that kind of like black and white Sith Jedi morality stuff going on, so if the show can set him up in a way that mass audiences respond to, I think that could be really cool. Is the show going to make a reference to Kanan Jarrus? Am I going to cry at this show? That is the big question. I have a hunch that we're going to get, you know, Hera hand on a photo of Kanan at some point looking sad, and that is going to absolutely ruin me. So looking forward to that, guys. Really excited to cry over Star Wars. And then finally, you guys, Chopper's coming back. Is that in focus? We're getting Chopper in Star Wars in live action. And I know I said all that stuff at the beginning about how live action versus animation is like an arbitrary distinction, and just because one is with real people doesn't make it any better. And I stand by that. But this guy, any more Chopper I get in my life, I'm excited. That's all for now, folks. If you enjoyed this video, let us know in the comments. Let me know what you're excited about for the Ahsoka show on Disney+. Let me know what your favourite kind of Ahsoka moments and storylines are from her long history in the Star Wars franchise. If you enjoyed this video and want to see me be nerdy about other things I quite like, you can watch videos on She-Hulk and Secret Invasion, which we did early this year. And you can subscribe to Digital Spy for more TV and movies videos, interviews with huge stars, and we've also got a long-running series on costume design, which is really good, which you should watch. And until next time, goodbye.